The story of the Romanov dynasty does not begin in blood, even though it will end there. It begins instead in exhaustion, in a Russia fractured by chaos at the dawn of the 17th century, where famine, foreign invasion, and civil collapse had reduced the idea of monarchy to a fragile hope rather than a divine certainty. When 16-year-old Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov was summoned in 1613 to accept the Russian crown, he was not crowned amid triumphal certainty, but lifted reluctantly onto a throne that had devoured men before him. The boy wept as he accepted the title of Tsar, fully aware, perhaps more than any ruler who would follow, that power in Russia came bound to suffering, sacrifice, and an unspoken bargain with fate itself. From that moment forward, the Romanovs ruled not merely as monarchs, but as custodians of an empire defined by scale, silence, and endurance. Russia was not governed like Western Europe, where aristocratic compromise and legal institutions gradually restrained royal authority. It was governed through distance, ritual, and awe. The Tsar was not simply a king, he was God's representative on earth, an autocrat whose authority flowed downward like winter itself, inescapable, harsh, and absolute. Over generations, the Romanovs learned that survival depended not only on strength, but on control of land, of the Orthodox Church, of the nobility, and, above all, of the narrative that bound ruler and subject together. As the centuries unfolded, the Romanov state expanded relentlessly. Forests, steppes, frozen seas, and distant mountain ranges were absorbed into a single imperial body that stretched across 11 time zones. Yet expansion did not bring stability. Each conquest increased the burden of governance, and each new territory carried populations with different languages, customs, and loyalties. To rule such an empire required not flexibility, but rigidity. The Romanovs governed through hierarchy, tradition, and fear of disruption. Reform, when it came, was cautious and often imposed from above, never negotiated from below. Peter the Great, towering in both stature and ambition, forced Russia violently into the modern world. He dragged the nobility into Western dress, reorganized the military, and built a new capital from marshland at staggering human cost. St. Petersburg rose as a symbol of imperial will, but beneath its palaces lay the bones of tens of thousands of laborers. This patterned grandeur built atop suffering became a recurring motif in Romanov rule. Power was displayed architecturally, ceremonially, and militarily, while dissent was absorbed quietly, often brutally, into the machinery of the state. Catherine the Great would refine this system, presenting herself as an enlightened monarch while reinforcing serfdom and aristocratic privilege. By the late 18th century, Russia appeared formidable to the outside world, yet deeply brittle within. Millions of peasants lived bound to land they did not own, governed by laws they could not influence, ruled by sovereigns they would never see. The Romanovs, secure within palaces of gold and iconography, increasingly mistook endurance for loyalty and silence for consent. The 19th century tested these assumptions mercilessly. Napoleon's invasion in 1812 left Moscow in flames but reinforced the myth of Russian resilience. The empire survived, but the trauma of war planted new questions about governance, national identity, and the cost of absolute rule. Decades later, the Decembrist revolt led by young aristocratic officers, inspired by European constitutionalism, was crushed swiftly, yet it terrified the monarchy. The lesson the Romanovs absorbed was not that reform was necessary, but that openness was dangerous. This fear hardened under Nicholas I, whose reign transformed censorship, surveillance, and repression into tools of routine governance. Russia became a state that listened obsessively for dissent while refusing to hear its causes. Intellectual life retreated into coded language, literature became a battlefield of ideas, and the distance between ruler and ruled widened into something approaching fatal misunderstanding. The empire appeared stable, yet it functioned like a sealed vessel under pressure, with no valve for release. By the time Alexander II ascended the throne, the system had begun to crack visibly. Military defeat in the Crimean War exposed technological backwardness and administrative rot. In response, Alexander II enacted the most dramatic reform in Romanov history, the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. It was a moral and political turning point, yet it arrived half-formed and poorly executed. Former serfs gained legal freedom, but remained economically trapped, burdened by debt and inadequate land. Reform created expectation without fulfillment, awakening social forces the monarchy could no longer fully control. When Alexander the Sioux was assassinated in 1881 by revolutionaries, the Romanov court interpreted the act not as a warning, but as confirmation that mercy bred chaos. His successors reversed course. Repression returned with renewed intensity. Industrialization accelerated, drawing millions into urban centers where poverty, radical politics, and labor unrest collided. Russia entered the 20th century as a paradox, a vast empire modernizing economically while remaining politically frozen in an earlier age. At the center of this contradiction stood Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar. Raised in isolation, steeped in ritual, and convinced of his divine mandate, Nicholas lacked both the temperament and the vision required to govern a rapidly changing society. He believed sincerely that autocracy was not a choice, but a sacred duty. To compromise power, in his view, was to betray God, his ancestors, and Russia itself. Yet sincerity offered no protection against reality. As the new century dawned, the Romanov dynasty stood at the height of its territorial reach and the edge of its moral collapse. Industrial strikes, peasant unrest, nationalist movements, and revolutionary ideologies converged beneath the surface of imperial splendor. The court retreated further inward, relying on ceremony, mysticism, and denial. The distance between palace and people became an abyss. The Romanovs had survived wars, rebellions, and assassinations before. But what they could not survive was a world that no longer believed in the inevitability of their rule. The forces gathering against them were not merely political or economic, they were psychological and existential. Faith in monarchy was eroding, replaced by the dangerous idea that history could be shaped by ordinary people. The blood that would one day stain the cellar in Yekaterinburg was not the result of a single revolution or a single decision. It was the final consequence of centuries of absolute power, exercised without accountability, of silence mistaken for stability, and of a dynasty that ruled an empire too vast to understand and too fragile to save. And as Europe edged toward the catastrophe of World War I, the Romanov dynasty, unaware of how little time remained, continued to perform the rituals of power, unwitting actors in the final act of an imperial tragedy already written. When the 20th century arrived, it did not announce itself gently to the Romanov dynasty. It came bearing machines, mass politics, and ideas that could not be contained by palace walls or police files. Nicholas II ascended the throne in 1894, convinced that he had inherited not merely a crown, but a sacred obligation to preserve autocracy exactly as it had been passed down to him. He was intelligent, deeply religious, and devoted to his family, yet profoundly unprepared for the forces reshaping Russia. His tragedy was not cruelty but rigidity. He believed history could be held still by will alone. From the outset, Nicholas ruled a society already in motion. Industrialization, aggressively pursued by the state, had transformed cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow into dense concentrations of workers living in brutal conditions. 12-hour shifts, unsafe factories, and starvation wages created a working class unlike anything Russia had known before. These men and women were no longer bound to landowners by tradition. They were bound to factories by necessity, and they began to organize, to strike, and to listen to radical ideas that framed suffering not as fate, but as injustice. At court, these developments were poorly understood. The Romanov worldview remained shaped by ceremony and hierarchy. Ministers filtered information carefully, fearing imperial displeasure. Nicholas, insulated by layers of loyalty and deference, interpreted unrest as moral failure rather than structural crisis. This misunderstanding would prove fatal. The first great rupture came in 1905. Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War shattered the myth of imperial invincibility. The war had been intended as a distraction, a demonstration of strength that would unify the nation. Instead, it exposed military incompetence, corruption, and logistical decay. News of defeat traveled faster than censorship could suppress it, igniting anger across the empire. In January of that year, thousands of workers marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace, led by Father Georgy Gapon. They carried icons and portraits of the Tsar, believing tragically that Nicholas would hear their pleas. He was not there. Troops opened fire. Hundreds were killed or wounded in what became known as Bloody Sunday. In a single afternoon, the emotional bond between Tsar and people was severed. The myth of the benevolent father-ruler died in the snow. What followed was a wave of strikes, mutinies, and uprisings that paralyzed the empire. Railways stopped. Factories closed. Even sections of the military rebelled. Faced with collapse, Nicholas conceded what he had sworn never to give: political reform. The October Manifesto promised civil liberties and the creation of an elected legislative assembly, the Duma. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Romanov dynasty might adapt. But adaptation required trust, and trust was already gone. Nicholas regarded the Duma not as a partner but as an intrusion. He dissolved it repeatedly when it challenged his authority, rewriting electoral laws to favor conservatives and landowners. Reform existed on paper, autocracy remained in practice. The result was cynicism rather than stability. Liberals felt betrayed, radicals felt confirmed, and the monarchy drifted further from the society it claimed to rule. As political legitimacy eroded, the Romanovs turned inward. Nowhere was this retreat more visible than in the private life of the imperial family. Nicholas and his wife, Empress Alexandra, withdrew from public engagement, focusing obsessively on their children, particularly their only son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. The illness haunted the court, symbolizing fragility at the very heart of empire. Into this vulnerability stepped Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose influence over Alexandra became both intimate and notorious. Rasputin's apparent ability to ease Alexei's suffering convinced the empress that he was divinely sent. At court, he became an unofficial power broker, intervening in appointments and policy through whispered counsel. To the public and the nobility alike, Rasputin embodied everything grotesque about a decaying regime: secrecy, superstition, and corruption masquerading as faith. The monarchy's credibility collapsed further with each rumor, each scandal, each minister dismissed at Rasputin's suggestion. The imperial government appeared not merely ineffective, but absurd. Faith in divine authority curdled into mockery. The Romanovs, once distant and feared, became objects of resentment and ridicule. Then came war. In 1914, Europe plunged into catastrophe, and Russia followed its allies into World War I. Nicholas II framed the conflict as a sacred struggle, a test of national unity. But the Russian state was catastrophically unprepared. Poor infrastructure, inadequate equipment, and incompetent leadership led to staggering losses. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Supply lines collapsed. Food shortages spread from cities to villages. In 1915, Nicholas made his most disastrous decision. He took personal command of the army. It was meant to inspire confidence. Instead, it tied every military failure directly to the Tsar himself. While Nicholas remained at the front, Alexandra governed in his absence, relying increasingly on Rasputin. Ministerial chaos intensified. Confidence evaporated. By 1916, Russia was breaking. Inflation destroyed wages. Bread lines stretched for hours. Soldiers deserted en masse. The aristocracy whispered openly of treason at court. Even members of the royal family warned Nicholas that disaster was imminent. He did not listen. To concede power still felt to him like moral collapse. In February 1917, the collapse arrived not as a dramatic coup, but as a series of uncontrollable events. Strikes over bread shortages escalated into mass demonstrations. Troops sent to suppress the crowds refused to fire or turned their weapons on their officers. The capital slipped out of imperial control almost overnight. With no loyal forces left to rely upon, Nicholas abdicated the throne. In a quiet railway carriage, the Romanov dynasty ended not with a coronation or execution, but with a signature. 3 centuries of autocratic rule dissolved in ink. The monarchy was gone. But the fate of the Romanov family themselves had not yet been sealed. They would soon learn that in a revolution driven by rage, fear, and vengeance, there was no safe distance from history. As political legitimacy eroded, the Romanovs turned inward. Nowhere was this retreat more visible than in the private life of the imperial family. Nicholas and his wife, Empress Alexandra, withdrew from public engagement, focusing obsessively on their children, particularly their only son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. The illness haunted the court, symbolizing fragility at the very heart of empire. Into this vulnerability stepped Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose influence over Alexandra became both intimate and notorious. Rasputin's apparent ability to ease Alexei's suffering convinced the empress that he was divinely sent. At court, he became an unofficial power broker, intervening in appointments and policy through whispered counsel. To the public and the nobility alike, Rasputin embodied everything grotesque about a decaying regime's secrecy, superstition, and corruption masquerading as faith. The monarchy's credibility collapsed further with each rumor, each scandal, each minister dismissed at Rasputin's suggestion. The imperial government appeared not merely ineffective, but absurd. Faith in divine authority curdled into mockery. The Romanovs, once distant and feared, became objects of resentment and ridicule. Then came war. In 1914, Europe plunged into catastrophe, and Russia followed its allies into World War I. Nicholas II framed the conflict as a sacred struggle, a test of national unity. But the Russian state was catastrophically unprepared. Poor infrastructure, inadequate equipment, and incompetent leadership led to staggering losses. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Supply lines collapsed. Food shortages spread from cities to villages. In 1915, Nicholas made his most disastrous decision. He took personal command of the army. It was meant to inspire confidence. Instead, it tied every military failure directly to the Tsar himself. While Nicholas remained at the front, Alexandra governed in his absence, relying increasingly on Rasputin. Ministerial chaos intensified. Confidence evaporated. By 1916, Russia was breaking. Inflation destroyed wages. Bread lines stretched for hours. Soldiers deserted en masse. The aristocracy whispered openly of treason at court. Even members of the royal family warned Nicholas that disaster was imminent. He did not listen. To concede power still felt to him like moral collapse. In February 1917, the collapse arrived not as a dramatic coup, but as a series of uncontrollable events. Strikes over bread shortages escalated into mass demonstrations. Troops sent to suppress the crowds refused to fire or turned their weapons on their officers. The capital slipped out of imperial control almost overnight. With no loyal forces left to rely upon, Nicholas abdicated the throne. In a quiet railway carriage, the Romanov dynasty ended not with a coronation or execution, but with a signature. 3 centuries of autocratic rule dissolved in ink. The monarchy was gone. But the fate of the Romanov family themselves had not yet been sealed. They would soon learn that in a revolution driven by rage, fear, and vengeance, there was no safe distance from history. The fall of the Romanov throne did not immediately mean the fall of the Romanov family. In the chaotic weeks following Nicholas II's abdication, Russia existed in a fragile limbo, governed by a provisional government that promised democracy but possessed little real authority. The former Tsar, now simply Colonel Romanov, remained a symbol too dangerous to release and too sensitive to destroy. His very existence embodied the unresolved question, at the heart of the revolution, whether Russia's future could truly escape its past. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were placed under house arrest, first at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. The setting was deceptively serene. Spring arrived, gardens bloomed, and the family attempted to maintain routines, lessons for the children, religious observances, walks under guard. Yet every gesture was stripped of dignity. Soldiers mocked them openly. Orders were barked instead of requested. Privacy vanished. The Romanovs, who had lived their lives enclosed by ritual and hierarchy, now encountered powerlessness for the first time. Nicholas recorded the days meticulously in his diary, noting weather, meals, and scripture readings, as though careful documentation might preserve a sense of order in a world unraveling beyond the palace gates. Alexandra, increasingly ill and emotionally withdrawn, clung to faith with absolute intensity. Their children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the fragile Alexei absorbed the transformation with quiet resilience, yet the strain was unmistakable. The illusion that captivity might be temporary lingered, but it was an illusion sustained by hope rather than evidence. Meanwhile, Russia plunged deeper into chaos. The provisional government proved incapable of halting war, stabilizing the economy, or asserting control over radical factions. Power fractured across Soviets, soldiers' councils, and revolutionary committees. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized control in Petrograd, overthrowing the provisional authorities with ruthless efficiency. The revolution hardened from reformist upheaval into ideological war. For the Romanovs, this shift was catastrophic. Under Bolshevik rule, their fate ceased to be a political problem and became a strategic one. They were no longer former monarchs. They were living symbols around which counter-revolutionary forces might rally. Mercy became incompatible with survival. To isolate them further, the family was moved east, deep into Siberia, first to Tobolsk. The journey itself marked a descent. Luxury carriages gave way to crude transport, servants were dismissed, possessions confiscated. The climate was brutal, the isolation profound. Tobolsk offered quiet but no safety. As civil war erupted between red and white forces, front lines shifted unpredictably. The Romanovs became hostages to geography and timing. In the spring of 1918, as white armies advanced toward Siberia, Bolshevik authorities made a decisive move. The family was transferred to Yekaterinburg, an industrial city firmly under Red control. There, they were confined in the Ipatiev House, ominously renamed the House of Special Purpose. The symbolism was unmistakable. Windows were boarded up. Guards were replaced with hardened revolutionaries. The rules grew harsher by the day. Inside the house, the Romanovs lived under constant surveillance. Conversations were monitored. Journals were read. Religious icons were removed. Alexandra and Alexei, weakened by illness, rarely left their rooms. Nicholas chopped wood in the yard when permitted, performing manual labor in a final, almost ritual stripping of imperial identity. The children slept fully clothed, sensing without fully understanding that danger had become permanent. Outside the house, the civil war intensified. White forces closed in on Yekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks faced a terrifying possibility: the Romanovs could be liberated, transformed into rallying symbols, or used as leverage by foreign powers. The question of their fate was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. On the night of July 16, 1918, the decision was made. Shortly after midnight, the family was awakened and told they were being moved for their safety. They were led down to the basement under the pretense of evacuation. Alexandra carried Alexei in her arms. Chairs were brought for the Empress and her son. The others stood close together in the dimly lit room. Then the order was read. The executioners opened fire. What followed was not a clean or orderly execution, but a brutal, chaotic massacre. Bullets ricocheted off hidden jewels sewn into the daughter's clothing. Smoke filled the room. Screams echoed. Bayonets were used when gunfire failed. Within minutes, an entire dynasty, parents, children, and loyal servants, was annihilated. The bodies were stripped, transported, burned, dissolved in acid, and buried in unmarked graves. The Bolsheviks announced only that Nicholas had been executed. The fate of the rest was concealed, denied, obscured by misinformation for decades. With that act, the Romanov dynasty ended not as it had ruled through ceremony and spectacle, but in secrecy, violence, and fear. The empire they had governed collapsed into civil war, famine, and ideological terror. Russia would emerge transformed, but at an immeasurable human cost. Yet history does not end with death. For generations, rumors persisted. Legends of survival, especially of Anastasia, captured the imagination of a world unwilling to accept such finality. Only in the late 20th century would forensic science confirm what history had already recorded in blood. The Romanovs were gone. But the consequences of their rule, their failures, and their tragic end would shape Russia and the modern world for the rest of the century. The execution of the Romanov family did not bring immediate clarity or closure. Instead, it opened a void filled with silence, denial, and myth. In the immediate aftermath, the Bolshevik leadership understood the gravity of what had been done. The deaths were not merely the elimination of political enemies, they were an irreversible rupture with Russia's imperial past. To acknowledge the full truth risked provoking outrage at home and condemnation abroad. And so, ambiguity became policy. For years, Soviet authorities maintained that only Nicholas II had been executed. The fate of Alexandra and the children was deliberately obscured, buried beneath contradictory statements and bureaucratic evasions. This uncertainty allowed rumors to flourish. Across Europe and America, immigrant communities clung to whispers of survival. Sightings were reported. Claimants emerged. Most famously, a woman later known as Anna Anderson insisted she was Grand Duchess Anastasia. Her story, fueled by trauma, physical resemblance, and the world's longing for a miracle, endured for decades. These legends were not merely sensational distractions. They reflected something deeper, a refusal to accept that history could end so absolutely, so brutally. The Romanovs had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. Their sudden annihilation felt incompatible with the slow rhythms of historical change. Myth stepped in where comprehension failed. Inside the Soviet Union, memory was reshaped to fit ideology. The Romanovs were portrayed as symbols of tyranny, decadence, and oppression, necessary sacrifices on the altar of revolutionary progress. Palaces became museums or government offices. Imperial rituals were erased or recontextualized. The Ipatiev house itself was eventually demolished in 1977 on the orders of Boris Yeltsin, then a regional party official, precisely because it had become a site of unofficial pilgrimage. The past, even in ruins, remained dangerous. Yet history proved resistant to erasure. As the Soviet system began to fracture in the late 20th century, suppressed questions resurfaced. In 1979, amateur investigators discovered a mass grave near Yekaterinburg. Political realities prevented immediate acknowledgement, but the truth had been unearthed literally. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, forensic teams, historians, and geneticists were finally permitted to investigate openly. DNA analysis, including comparisons with living relatives such as Prince Philip of Britain, confirmed the identities of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. Later discoveries accounted for the remaining children. Science did what ideology could not. It ended the myths with evidence and replaced rumor with fact. The Romanovs had not escaped. They had been destroyed completely and irrevocably. In 1998, 80 years after their deaths, the remains of the Imperial family were reinterred with state honors at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russian emperors. The ceremony was solemn, restrained, and laden with contradiction. Representatives of a post-Soviet Russia stood beside Orthodox clergy, acknowledging both the crimes of the past and the complexity of remembrance. It was not a restoration of monarchy, nor an absolution of imperial rule, but an act of historical reconciliation long deferred. The Russian Orthodox Church later canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children as passion-bearers, figures who faced suffering with humility and faith rather than resistance. This designation was deeply controversial. Critics argued that sanctification risked romanticizing autocracy and ignoring the suffering endured by millions under Romanov rule. Supporters countered that personal virtue and political failure were not the same. The debate itself revealed how unresolved the Romanov legacy remained. Globally, the fall of the Romanovs reshaped the 20th century. Their execution symbolized the end of divine monarchy as a governing principle in Europe. It accelerated the polarization of ideologies, hardening the divide between revolutionary socialism and traditional power structures. The Russian Civil War that followed claimed millions of lives, setting the stage for the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and a century defined by ideological confrontation. Yet the Romanov story endures not because of geopolitics alone, but because it is profoundly human. At its core, it is a narrative of inherited power confronting a modern world it could not comprehend, of a family trapped between history and inevitability, and of a society that chose destruction over reform when the moment for compromise had passed. The Romanovs were neither monsters nor martyrs in the simple sense. They were products of a system that demanded absolute authority while denying accountability, that sanctified tradition while fearing change. Their deaths were not an aberration, but the final consequence of a structure that left no peaceful path forward. In the quiet halls of former palaces, in archival photographs of solemn faces frozen in time, and in the cellar where history ended in gunfire, the Romanovs continue to ask an uncomfortable question: how long can power exist without listening, before it becomes deaf to its own collapse? The answer, written in blood and silence, remains one of the most enduring lessons of modern history. History rarely delivers verdicts with the clarity of a courtroom. It does not pronounce guilt or innocence, nor does it offer redemption in any final sense. Instead, it leaves behind layers of cause and consequence, of intention and outcome, of private lives entangled with public power. The Romanov dynasty, viewed from this distance, exists within those layers, neither fully condemned nor absolved, but understood as a tragic convergence of human limitation and historical momentum. To judge the Romanovs solely by their end is to misunderstand their beginning. They ruled an empire forged in an age when absolute power was not an aberration but a norm, when legitimacy flowed from lineage and ritual rather than consent. For centuries, that system endured not because it was just, but because it functioned binding together vast territories through obedience, faith, and fear. The Romanovs inherited that machinery fully formed, and they never learned how to dismantle it without destroying themselves in the process. Nicholas II, more than any of his predecessors, embodied the paradox of imperial collapse. He was not cruel by temperament, nor indifferent to suffering, yet he believed with unwavering conviction that compromise was weakness and that reform threatened moral order. This belief, rooted in faith and reinforced by tradition, blinded him to the realities unfolding beyond palace walls. His failure was not one of intention, but of perception. He could not imagine a Russia that did not need a Tsar, and therefore could not save one. The revolution that destroyed the Romanovs did not arise from a single ideology or leader. It emerged from decades of accumulated frustration, from peasants bound by poverty, workers crushed by industrial exploitation, soldiers sacrificed in feudal wars, and intellectuals suffocated by censorship. When the structure finally collapsed, it did so not because it was attacked from outside, but because it had hollowed itself from within. The violence that followed the executions, the civil war, the terror was not inevitable, but it was made possible by a system that had denied peaceful transformation for too long. The Bolsheviks claimed to act in the name of history, yet they too would build a state reliant on silence, fear, and absolute authority. In this sense, the Romanovs did not merely fall. They were replaced by a different incarnation of centralized power, one that rejected crowns but preserved control. Today, the Romanov story persists not as nostalgia for monarchy, but as a warning embedded in human memory. It reminds us that legitimacy cannot be inherited forever, that power without accountability becomes brittle, and that tradition, when unexamined, can transform stability into stagnation. The grandeur of palaces and the splendor of ceremonies cannot compensate for the absence of trust between ruler and ruled. In Russia, the legacy remains deeply contested. For some, the Romanovs represent national continuity, faith, and sacrifice. For others, they symbolize oppression, inequality, and missed opportunity. These interpretations coexist uneasily, reflecting a society still negotiating its relationship with authority and history itself. The Romanovs are remembered not because they were perfect, but because their fall was absolute. Beyond Russia, their story resonates universally. It speaks to all societies that place faith in permanence, that assume institutions will endure simply because they always have. The Romanovs believed their empire was eternal. It was not. No empire is. In the end, what lingers is not the sound of gunshots in a basement, but the quieter tragedy that preceded them: a ruling family isolated by belief, a people unheard by power, and a moment when reform might have spared countless lives, but passed unrecognized. The Romanovs ruled for 300 years. They fell in a single generation. Between those two truths lies the fragile space where history is decided. And when that space closes, even the mightiest dynasties vanish into silence. As the echoes of empire fade into history, what remains is not the crown, not the palace, and not even the blood-stained cellar where the Romanov dynasty met its end. What remains is a question quiet, unsettling, and timeless. How does power lose its ability to listen? And at what moment does tradition, once a source of stability, become the very force that guarantees collapse? The Romanovs did not fall because history turned against them overnight. They fell because they believed endurance was the same as legitimacy, that silence meant loyalty, and that authority inherited was authority deserved. For centuries, this belief held. But the modern world does not wait for tradition to adapt. It moves forward, indifferent to crowns, rituals, and divine claims. When rulers refuse to change with their people, history does not negotiate, it replaces them. The tragedy of the Romanovs is not only that they lost power, but that they lost the chance to transform it. Reform arrived too late, compromise felt like betrayal, and humility was mistaken for weakness. By the time the empire recognized the depth of its crisis, the language of trust had already been replaced by the language of force. And force, once unleashed, does not discriminate. This story is not confined to Russia, nor to the 20th century. It is a universal warning. Every empire, every institution, every system that believes itself untouchable eventually faces the same test: adapt or disappear. The Romanovs remind us that history does not punish ambition, but it is unforgiving of arrogance. Power that cannot hear will one day be overthrown by voices it ignored. Yet within this collapse lies a deeply human story. A family shaped by belief, constrained by tradition, and ultimately consumed by the weight of a role they did not fully understand. Their fate invites neither celebration nor simple condemnation, but reflection, because the line between ruler and subject, between authority and accountability, is thinner than empires would like to admit. If this story moved you, challenged you, or changed the way you see history, we invite you to become part of the conversation. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the rise and fall of empires, dynasties, and the forces that shape our world. Share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons do you believe history is still trying to teach us today? History lives only as long as we continue to question it. And every story you watch, every comment you leave, keeps that dialogue alive. Thank you for watching.